Ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here to this Wallace Wurth Lecture. This room is at capacity, which is absolutely marvellous, and we've had more than 730 people register as guests, which is testimony both to the series of lectures and also to our speaker, our guest speaker, who I'll refer to in a minute. Can I, in welcoming you all, please show my respects by acknowledging the Bejugal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which this university stands. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be present in the audience today. Ladies and gentlemen, as I say, I welcome each and every one of you, but I would like, if I may, to particularly mention just a couple of people. Firstly, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Professor the Honourable Dame Mari Bashir here today. Some of you may say that's because she's a past governor of the state, others that she was Chancellor of the other place. But in fact, and despite that, I welcome her because she was a member of staff of this university, and it's absolutely wonderful to see her back here. I also want to remind you that the Wallace Wurth Lecture, which commenced in 1964, a long time ago, which is one of our premier events, was named after the first president of the Council of the University, actually it was of the Council of New South Wales University of Technology, which for those of you who are not up on your history will not know was our original name. And Wallace Wurth became the first Chancellor of this university. It is also significant because of tonight. If you have a look at the name of the medical school, it also bears his name. It is a great pleasure to me to see so many members of the Wurth family here. And if I may, I welcome particularly Megan, Jane, Annabelle, David and Peter, and also Barbara Buttery here today. You're very welcome and it's wonderful to see you. I should also add, for those of you, and particularly given what we're going to talk about tonight, who are wondering, didn't I just attend a Wallace Wurth about 3 months ago? The answer is you're not demented, you did. We had to prove to the Wurth family that we can do 2 in 3 months, and it's good to see them all here as we were there too, and it's wonderful that this premier season continues. But tonight we're here for a very special occasion, to hear Dr. Tom Insel deliver a speech which is entitled Science and Technology, New Frontiers for Helping People with Mental Illness. Dr. Insel is a neuroscientist and psychiatrist. He joined Verily Life Sciences recently, and for those of you who don't know what Verily Life Sciences is, its previous name was the Life Sciences team at Google. He did that in December 2015, last year. His idea there, on the idea given to him by Alphabet, the new name for the Google holding company, was to lead a new effort that will have a good look at mental health and see what can be done with it. Prior to that, Tom was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a component of the US National Institutes of Health, which are committed to research on mental disorders. Tom served as director of this $1.5 billion agency from 2002 until 2015, when he moved to Verily. During his tenure, he focused on the genetics and neurobiology of mental disorders, as well as transforming approaches in the diagnosis and treatment of them. Prior to serving in this role, Dr. Insel was Professor of Psychiatry at Emory University, where he was the founding director of the Center for Behavioral Neuroscience and a director of the Yerkes Regional Primate Center in Atlanta. His research has examined the neural basis of complex social behaviors, including maternal care and attachment. He is well, as they say, decorated. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and has received numerous national and international awards, which I Googled, given that he's from Google, this morning, and decided you didn't come to hear hours of that, and I will spare you. It is a great honour for us to continue the great tradition of this university and the Wallace Wurth Lectures to invite Dr. Tom Insel to address us today.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that wonderful introduction, and it is truly a great pleasure and an honor to be in this series. My thanks to the Wurth family. It's wonderful to have you be able to participate in this as well. And I must say, this is the end of a 3-week tour of Australia for myself and my wife. We've been in lots of meetings, lots of talks, and it's been such a special moment to realize the talent that you have here. I think the one thing that has surprised me most is the fact that in the face of such talent, there's often not the understanding or the appreciation of the quality of work that is going on in Sydney and in Melbourne. And it's been great for me to see it. As David mentioned, I've recently moved from Washington, D.C., where I had been for most of my career, to San Francisco, and that move was to discover a city in which coffee, food, and football are really considered very important. I had no idea until I came to Sydney that San Francisco actually is second to Sydney in its obsession with those same virtues. So this has been a lot of fun. It's been a wonderful several days here. I'm meeting with people from Black Dog Institute, from this university, from the University of Sydney, and just getting a sense of the amount of innovation taking place here. Really inspiring. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to take you on a bit of a tour. I'd like to talk to you about mental illness, help you to think initially about the problems that we're facing and how we define the issues. I should say at the outset that we're still struggling with what to call this problem. I don't think we have that problem so much when we talk about diabetes or cardiovascular disease or cancer, but here the language we use is a little tortuous. Sometimes we call these mental health problems or ill mental health or mental ill health or mental disorders or mental illness. Some people now say brain disorders. We're still struggling with our semantics. But whatever we call them, I think one thing we need to appreciate, both as in the academic community, in the clinical community, and for the public at large, is the enormous public health burden that these illnesses deploy. If you just take a look at these numbers on this graph, these are from studies done through the World Health Organization. And much to most people's surprise, when you look across all of medicine at the sources of disability, here measured as years lost to disability, what you find is that mental and behavioral disorders are way out ahead of cancer, heart disease, diabetes. Many of the other sort of more common or often what are considered more serious medical problems. And you can see that actually if it's severity you care about, disability you care about, actually it's these disorders, schizophrenia, depression, PTSD, ADHD, the eating disorders, the anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, that account for about 25% of all disability or years lost to disability. Many reasons for that, one of which is that they are in fact severe and disabling. But perhaps what's most contributes to these numbers is the life course, that these occur much earlier. 75% of adults with mental illness will describe onset before age 25. 75% of adults will have onset before age 25. And obviously, that's very different than the story you would see with cancer, heart disease, diabetes, pulmonary diseases. And you can see pretty much in this graph, which looks across the lifespan at when disability kicks in, that actually the red line, which is the mental and behavioral disorders, account for virtually all of the disability before age 45, more than all other medical sources put together. So in beginning to think about this, the first thing to recognize is not only are these common, not only are they disabling, but these are, in some ways, the chronic illnesses of young people in the developed world and also in the developing world. In the case of Australia, the numbers that come from this recent report of the National Review of Mental Health Programs lays it out something like this: about 3 million people, so a little more than 10% affected, about 625,000 with pretty severe disabling illnesses, and then about 1/10 of those having really chronic, and in this case, continuous, persistent, complex, as they call them, multi-agency needs. Quite a challenge, and it's also important to remember that for every person who shows up on this graph, there will be many, many other people affected. Somebody once said to me that there are really only two kinds of people in the world: someone who loves somebody with a mental illness and somebody who loves somebody with a mental illness that hasn't happened yet. So these are illnesses that in some way affect all of us. We all have family members, if we ourselves are not so affected. We've been talking mostly about disability or morbidity, but it's important to remember that mortality is also an issue here. We tend to think of heart disease and cancer as the big killers, but look at the numbers that we're talking about globally from suicide. 90% of the time involving a mental illness. 800,000 deaths per year. Really extraordinary. Again, these are WHO, World Health Organization numbers. Men affected more often than women. More than 50% of all violent deaths are self-inflicted. That's an extraordinary number to recognize. And there are about 20 times more suicide attempts than there are suicide deaths. So I show you this because I just don't think we have quite recognized the public health crisis that we're dealing with here. We have such a focus on terrorism, such a focus on homicide, such a focus on issues that have to do with much more public and often media-driven sources of mortality. And yet, suicide is a much larger public health challenge, and maybe most important, and a point made by this report from the WHO, it's important to remember that we can actually address this one and prevent suicide. Maybe not 100%, but we can do much, much better. It should be unacceptable that we're looking at 800,000 deaths per year that are self-inflicted. What's it look like in Australia? There's a recent report from this Suicide Prevention Australia group that has collected some numbers, and even in their report they say, look, this is tough to get the right data. Sometimes it's not obvious what's a suicide and what isn't. People don't always leave notes. Sometimes with drug overdoses it's unclear. There are just lots of gray areas here, but they've done the best they could to look at the data we have. And you can see the numbers: 7.8 deaths per day. So 2,864 deaths in Australia from suicide, about the same as we lose from breast cancer, almost the same as we're losing from prostate cancer. So these are very, very significant numbers. In this report, they point out that actually there's some good news, and the fact is that the rate has come down a bit, particularly in young people, over the last decade. And that's great to see. And they point out that something called postvention, so it's the opposite of prevention. Postvention is after someone makes an attempt, hanging in there to make sure they don't make another attempt. So it's following instead of preventing. You're postventing. That's a little bit of a strange word, but in this case, it does look like that's had some impact on reducing the numbers, particularly in young people. But they also point out that there's still much to do, that there's enormous health disparities here, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait youth 4 times more likely to die than other youth in this country, that we have problems still in getting to the people who need services at the very moment when they need them, and there are problems even collecting the best data that we would like to have to be able to track this in the way we want. The numbers we have, if you look at this across the lifespan again, from the adolescents on the left-hand side of this graph to over 85 on the right-hand side. You can see the numbers are high. They're about average for an OECD country, so this is about the same as what you'd see in the US. The shape of the curve is interesting. Males, again, much more likely to die from suicide than females. And even though we talk a lot about suicide in youth, you can see that the numbers actually are higher in this group from about age 30 to about age 50, particularly in men. And that's something that I think is going to require more attention going forward. We're also always struggling, and this is true in Europe, in the US, in Australia, with suicide in older men, men over the age of 55, or actually men over the age of 75, where the rate begins to climb in a very dramatic way. It's about 6 times higher in that age group than it is overall for the population. So we don't talk much about that, but that's an area of extraordinary need and importance. Morbidity, mortality, say a word about cost. This was looked at by the World Economic Forum, which is a group that is very interested in the costs of various social and health issues related to challenges in the developing world. And they, about 5 years ago, pulled a group together from the Harvard School of Public Health to work on the costs of non-communicable diseases. What they came up with that can be summarized here in this graph. They projected out what was going to be the largest source of costs. In their modeling, they were really focused mostly on cardiovascular disease and cancer, but they threw in mental illness as a kind of control and were stunned to find that this actually accounted for more costs than diabetes, respiratory diseases, and cancer put together. In fact, the actual numbers that they came up with are pretty remarkable. $2.5 trillion estimated in 2010, but increasing almost threefold, or up to $6 trillion by 2030. So the point they made is we have to do something about this to begin to avert these enormous costs that will just be increasing and will be greatest within mental illness. Finally, it's worth noting that with this very high disability, if one looks across both the developing and the developed world, where the disability rates may be as high in terms of years lost to disability, somewhere between 25% and 30% of all medical sources of years lost to disability. And yet, in those light green bars on the left, you can see that, in fact, the medical spend, what we're investing in mental health care, is never more than about 5% of what we're investing for all medical causes. So we have an obvious disconnect. And there are many reasons about this. One of the things that I think we have to begin thinking about is the ways in which we just haven't paid attention to something that should be right in front of our faces, that is huge disability, huge costs, huge mortality, and yet we're not really addressing this. So my summary of what I've told you in terms of a problem statement is right here. In the same way that the 20th century was about infectious diseases, and we had a model that dealt with acute diseases and providing antibiotics to cure them, the 21st century is going to be about non-communicable diseases, the ones I've been mentioning: cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and mental illness. Brain disorders, whether you think about the mental illnesses or the neurological, neurodegenerative diseases of late life, are going to be the most disabling and the most costly of these chronic diseases. And the point that I need to make sure you understand is that right now in 2016, we actually don't know enough to be able to solve this challenge. These are really complicated, difficult problems. And what we have to do right now is to think about how we're going to get the fundamentals, the information that we need to be able to address them, and to do for these disorders what we've already begun to do for cancer, what we've done for heart disease, where we've seen a 63% reduction in mortality, what we've done for HIV, where we've seen about a 90% reduction in mortality. The good news is that we've got a lot happening that's coming out of the science related to mental illness. And what I want to do, if this is the kind of morbid problem statement that I've laid out for you is to suggest that we've got three areas that really can provide a solution, or a set of solutions, or at the very least, at this point, a very hopeful opportunity. Neuroscience, genomics, and technology. And I'd like to spend most of the next 20 minutes or so walking you through what each of them are beginning to tell us, because it's pretty amazing. We'll start with genomics. And I use this term revolution, and I actually mean that, because I think we talk about revolutions when things have changed in a way that's dramatic and really transformed the way we think about a problem. Here's what the genomic revolution looks like, and it's largely because of changes in technology that today, relative to a decade ago, genomic sequencing is cheaper, it's faster, it's better than we could have imagined in 2006. Look at that difference from $22 million for a human genome down to about $1,000 today. It's hard to think of any other area of our economy that has changed that much. That's about 10 times better than Moore's Law. And it'd be wonderful if we could have made those investments and reaped the rewards as an economic problem alone. As it turns out, it's been a fantastic medical problem, and it's just beginning to reap rewards in terms of public health. When I started at the NIMH and we went after the genetics of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, it was taking us a couple of years to do each genome, and at this point, that's something that a postdoc would be able to do in the matter of about a day. But perhaps most important, what's changed over the last 10 years is not just the technology, but the culture, the way we do the science. Because what we do today is we bring people together. These are big questions, and they require lots of data. And the way we get lots of data is through scientists collaborating in a way that really wasn't happening a decade ago. So something like the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium now has 800 scientists across 30 countries. And the result is that we've gone from a very few findings to now having these massive amounts of DNA, almost 1 million samples with which to look across 10 different diseases. And we're beginning to find something, which is really great. You can see this increase, which really took off in about 2008, 2009, and then began to climb as people began to combine data across laboratories. And you can see there on the right that for diseases like schizophrenia, BD, which is bipolar disorder, syndromic autism, SYN, or ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, or ADHD, or major depressive disorder, we have indeed begun to find variations in genes that are associated with risks for the illness. But it's weird. The way this has played out is not the way any of us would have expected. As just one picture with a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago, if you start to map the genetic findings across all of these different diseases, autism, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and that's what each of these nodes would be here, it doesn't look like the genetic findings track necessarily with any given disease. So the same genes are often associated with many, many different disorders. That's what this kind of spider web tells you, is that these are not islands, they're actually very interconnected because the same findings are showing up whether you're studying bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or ADHD. If you had asked me 15 years ago or 10 years ago what the genetics or the fundamental biology of depression and schizophrenia would be, I would have probably pointed you to what we call monoamines. 90%, actually 98% of the literature about those disorders were about serotonin and dopamine. Ironically, when you actually begin to do the science and look at the genetics that come up, you see just about everything except dopamine and serotonin. It's really been fascinating that the number of genes that have shown up across those 150 or so findings cover many, many different aspects of biology, from circadian rhythms to chromatin remodeling, which is the way the DNA is packaged. But perhaps most interestingly, what comes up over and over again are genes important for how brains get built. Neurodevelopmental genes, often actually genes that aren't even expressed in the adult brain, but are only expressed in the second trimester of human brain development. How cool is that? Because it tells you for the first time that maybe the fundamentals here, the mechanisms that we should be looking at, are truly neurodevelopmental, and that what we really need to understand is how brains get wired together and what the interaction is of nature and nurture in those first months, often prenatal, for early development. I could go on for a couple of hours about where the genetics is taking us, but let me just summarize, because I have lots of other things other stories I want to tell you about, and to say that I think what we can say in 2016 is really three things from the genetics. First of all, what we're really studying here is not the cause of these illnesses. We don't know that we can ever relate these to cause in the way that we talk about for cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. In this case, we're really looking at the architecture of risk. And I say that because this is not simple genetics, it's complex genetics. It's like the genetics of height. Here we're talking about hundreds of genes, each of which may contribute only a very small amount of risk or small increase in the likelihood that you or someone with a particular variant will develop depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. It contributes, but it contributes in a very small way. And the thought is that maybe if there are a couple of hundred genes like that, it's when you get enough of them piled up that the risk begins to build up, and maybe those genes even interact in a way to increase that risk. But it's very clear that this is not as simple as nature versus nurture. It's nature through genomics putting you at risk for a whole series of environmental impacts that have a greater effect because of your genomic architecture, your architecture of risk. Finally, as I showed you with that spider web slide, I think what has been so interesting to many of us is that it's clear that nature never read the diagnostic manual, that the way that we have categorized these illnesses by symptoms in no way overlaps what the genetics is telling us. And so it's going to force us to rethink diagnostics in a really profound way. Let me move on to talk about the second revolution, which is the one in neuroscience. And here again, we talk about this as a revolution because really in the same way that technology has changed genomics, as you'll see, technology is completely changing the way we can think about brain development and brain function. As just one example, if you look at the way we do brain imaging today, it's actually quite different than where we were 10 years ago. We have scanners that are much higher resolution. We have protocols that are actually much easier in some ways and easier to combine across studies. But again, perhaps what's changed the most is the culture of the science we're doing. That today, what we do is put studies together from many, many different sites to be able to build large databases. These are, again, big data questions. They're tough areas to study because there's so much variation. And if you want to do good science in an area where there's a lot of variation, you need big numbers. So in this case, once again, we have something like over 3,000 scans that are in databases that anyone anywhere can begin to study. What we're beginning to do is provide better ways of analyzing those, and for the first time, beginning to look at neuroimaging in a way to try to make causal inferences rather than simply looking at correlations and saying, oh, here's a blob that lights up when someone is happy, here's a blob that lights up when someone is angry. We're trying to do better to understand how the brain actually functions by looking at imaging. But to be, entirely clear about this, this has not moved the way that genomics has moved. We don't have that kind of radical shift in being able to do this better, faster, cheaper, except perhaps in the studies that we can do in animals. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. A mechanism that was developed, or method that was developed 2 or 3 years ago called Clarity. Clarity is actually an acronym, but I couldn't even begin to explain how they got to that acronym from the words that they're putting together because it doesn't follow very easily. But suffice it to say that Carl Dijsselroth and his colleagues at Stanford have done some very interesting work. On the left is a mouse brain. It's sitting over a famous quote from Ramon y Cajal, who's the father of modern neuroanatomy. And what Carl Dijsselroth and his colleagues at Stanford have done is to really change the way we will be doing neuroanatomy in the future. That middle panel, the same brain is there after it has had all the fat taken out of it. It's called delipidating. There's lots of words for this, but it's clarified. It's suddenly become a translucent or transparent tissue. But if you use fluorescent dyes, you can see on the right, that suddenly it's visible. That is, you can stain for a whole variety of targets in the brain, and you'll be able to see them. Now, the beauty of this is you don't have to slice the brain the way we've always had to do. You take the brain out, you slice it into 1,000 sections, you put them on microscope slides, and you look at it slide by slide and try to put the story together of what's connected to what. Nowadays, you can leave the brain intact, and you can develop the kind of microscopy that allows you to sail through a brain that's been stained. In this case, this has been stained with a green dye for particular cells that express a gene called Thi1, but you could stain it for a whole range of different kinds of markers. Some of them would be genes, some of them might be proteins, some of them could be other factors in the brain. And you can begin to look at how things are really connected in a brain that's intact for the first time. At the cellular level, you can look down to see individual cells. Here we're sailing through the mouse brain and looking at the different areas, including areas involved with the cortex, areas for like the hippocampus that you can see there, in a way that allows us to see the relationships between brain areas. Now, this is beautiful and it's kind of fun to think about it. It's not going to be particularly helpful for studies in humans because it's a post-mortem approach. You have to take the brain out and you have to take the fat out of the brain, and then you can begin to get these spectacular videos. It's also not telling us how the brain's working. I mean, what we really want to know is not just what's connected to what, but how does the whole thing function? What's going on that causes behavior? What's the code? And the tools for that are a little bit further behind, but they're coming along as well. Someone who works in the same building just down the hall at Stanford from Carl Deiseroth is Mark Schnitzer, who's an engineer turned neuroscientist. Carl's a psychiatrist, interestingly. Mark comes from a different angle, but he's interested in optics. So he's developed a technique which he calls microendoscopy, and essentially it's a tiny, tiny microscope that goes directly into the brain of a mouse. So in the panel on the left, what you see in red are cells that have been genetically engineered to light up when they're active. These are neurons that when they're active turn red, as you can see. In the middle is a mouse that has this microscope implanted and has already had this genetic change so that the cells will light up when it's active. And the mouse is running around an 8-arm, it really is 8 arms, radial arm maze. And what you see in the right is a view through this microscope of what's happening in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the brain's GPS system. It's its navigation area that encodes place and space. So think about that for a moment. So what you're actually looking at with those cells firing on the right is as those cells are lighting up, they're turning green here when they light up, you're seeing the code. You're seeing what it is that has to be happening for the mouse to be able to know where it is in space. The hippocampus is important for memory as well as for navigation. So the question becomes actually a very interesting one. And what Mark and his team have asked themselves is, could we decode this at the speed of thought, at the speed of behavior, so that looking at that pattern on the right, we'd be able to say where the mouse is in the maze? Could we get that good? We'd be able to actually read the code of how the brain is making sense of the world in terms of at least navigation and location. They're not there. They're at the point where they're within about a mouse length, so they're getting better. They have to do more cells. They have to get a little faster. They have to have a somewhat broader field of view. But it gives you a sense of where this revolution is taking us. As President Obama said when he initiated the U.S. Brain Initiative, and hopefully there'll be a brain initiative here in Australia to match it, but Obama's vision was to be able to decode the language of the brain at the speed of thought. And that's very much where the field is going. It's great if you're a mouse. What if you're a human? Well, we're not quite there. We don't have the tools yet to read that code in the human brain. What we can do is non-invasive imaging. And for that, what we've done is what's called the Human Connectome Project. Like the Human Genome Project, which tried to get at the range of human variation in the genome, the Human Connectome Project is looking at the wiring diagram of the human brain, both the structure and the function of that wiring diagram, and trying to figure out how do we all differ. So this is taking 1,200 people and using a whole series of different modes of neuroimaging that are shown here. They're not actually invasive. Putting all of this data together with an enormous amount of information about the person's behavior, their cognition, their genome, and trying to make a database that anyone anywhere can begin to explore to understand the fundamentals of how the brain is wired together, the human brain. So what have we learned so far? Again, as a very brief summary of what is an enormous amount of work, I think we can say with some confidence that we have the tools now to begin to think about mental disorders as brain disorders. It's probably not going to be like the neurological disorders in which you have an area of dead tissue, like with Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. These are much more going to be circuit disorders. If it's helpful, you can think about the difference in the heart between a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, where you actually have a patch of dead tissue of heart muscle, versus an arrhythmia. Now, both of those will kill you, but in the arrhythmia, it's not that easy to actually find a focal area of tissue that's dead. It's really a functional problem. And that may be what we're really talking about here with mental illnesses. It's very clear already that when we begin to look at the circuits, we can find circuits that are associated, just as we're finding the genes associated with each of these disorders, but there's enormous individual variation. And there's a lot that we're going to have to try to pull apart to figure out what really matters and what doesn't in this space. The other thing that's been so interesting with this last 4 or 5 years in this world of human neuroscience is to realize not only the individual variation, but the variation within individuals. That is, how we each change from one day to the next based on experience. The brain, perhaps more than any other organ in our body, is capable of enormous plasticity. And that plasticity is fascinating because it tells you that so little about what our brains do is determined. One of the areas that's been so interesting to watch is in people who are undergoing behavioral therapy or various forms of psychotherapy, because for a long time there was this tension between the sort of deterministic kind of structural neuroscience people and the psychologists, and there was a lot of feeling that there'll never be a way to bridge those. And what's become so incredibly obvious is that if you want to change brain circuits, there's no better way to do it than through psychotherapy or through anything that involves learning, whether it's playing the violin or learning a map in a city or learning something about yourself that can happen through these psychotherapies. So what an interesting time to begin to put all of this together. Now, when I was at NIH, I spent a lot of time touring the country talking about the opportunities we had through genetics and neuroscience to really change the world for people with mental illness. And I was giving a lecture, I think it was in Portland, Oregon, a few years back, and someone at the back of the room in the question and answer period started off by saying this, that our house is on fire and you're telling me about the chemistry of the paint. You just don't have a clue what's really going on. For families that have a 23-year-old with schizophrenia or a 45-year-old with severe depression or even a 4-year-old with autism, that this genetics and neuroscience is academically really cool stuff, but man, it is not helpful because we need something in the short term. And in fact, that's not just true in Portland, Oregon, it's true here as well. This report that came out a couple of years ago on the state of mental health care in Australia was pretty critical. And if you boil it down, basically said, look, as I've already told you, high morbidity, high mortality, high costs, this is all unacceptable. So why are we doing so badly? Why haven't we been able to bend the curve here and do for these disorders what we have been able to do for AIDS, for cardiovascular disease, what we're doing now for cancer, especially childhood cancers, where we've gone from diseases that were 90% fatal and they're now 90% cured? This report, as well as other reports, have come up with a set of about 4 or 5 barriers to progress, and I'll take you through them very quickly. One of them clearly has to do with access. If you have 10 people with serious mental illness, you can be pretty certain that only about 4 or 40% are getting services at any given time. And of those, about 40% are getting services that you would consider are scientifically based, and of those, maybe a third are responding as well as they would if they were getting really optimal services. That's not great stats. That's not where you want to be. And it's not where we are right now for childhood cancer or even for cardiovascular disease. We've got enormous fragmentation. This is an area unlike any other in medicine, where you've got silos of psychological care, medical care, whole range of social supports and family supports that just don't talk to each other and haven't been brought together in any way to optimize outcomes. That particular report, I thought, did a nice job in Australia calling this the missing middle. There's nothing to make this cohere for the individual patient, and people find themselves bounced between these different silos trying to get care that works. We're late in the game, and in medicine, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about diabetes or cancer or psychosis or schizophrenia. We don't do well when we get there late. This is a picture which is actually probably originally generated by folks here in Australia who have worked so much, more than anywhere else, on thinking about the trajectory of an illness like schizophrenia and pointing out, as you can see in that green line, that psychosocial functioning begins to drop well before somebody has a psychotic break. Psychotic break happens at age 19, changes begin at age 16 or 15. Grades drop, social isolation, some cognitive problems, and lots of issues that tell you that this is a kid who's on this pathway. The problem is that we've been getting engaged at this point. A couple of years later, when someone's had a couple of psychotic breaks, they're no longer able to stay in school, they're not able to work, and they're becoming chronically disabled. Huge needs at that point, but this is where you want to be. You want to be able to crank this to a much earlier stage so that you're actually preempting many of the disabilities that occur after multiple psychotic episodes. In the US, with a recent study that was done, that came out just a few months ago, shows that the average duration of untreated psychosis was 1.5 years, which is just unthinkable, really unimaginable that we would wait that long to get care for people who are on this trajectory. And finally, it's not just a question of delay and access and fragmentation, but there's a problem with the quality of care. And this is a report that came out from the National Academy of Medicine about 1 year ago, tried to get a picture of what's going on with psychotherapy, with psychosocial treatments, and recognize that we're in an area unlike any other in medicine where most of the workforce has no actual scientific or medical training, but even more to the point that for those who are providing mental health services, most of them, social workers, psychologists, have no training in the very therapies that have a scientific basis. Again, imagine that. If I told you that that was true for breast cancer, you just would say, that can't be. And yet, look, the mortality here is equivalent to breast cancer. And you wonder why. This is an area completely outside of regulation. And most of all, and I think this is really the most egregious part of this story, what you get or what your loved one gets when they go for treatment depends much more on who they go to see than what they have. Again, something that should be completely unacceptable. And this isn't just Australia. These are the same slides I would use in the US, in the EU for that matter as well. So to summarize, we've got disorders with early onset, high morbidity, high mortality, very high costs. And here's the real clincher. And this is the thing that nobody seems to be aware of. So unlike dementia, unlike ALS, unlike most neurodegenerative disorders, for these disorders, we have pretty good treatments. Some of them are medicines, some of them are psychotherapies, some of them are devices. But for virtually every form of mental illness, we have something that works pretty damn well. So isn't that particularly outrageous that here where we have treatments that work, we don't provide them to the people who need them? And why don't we? Well, I've just told you. Access, fragmentation, delay, poor quality, and many people would say it's really because of stigma, that this is somehow different from other areas of medicine. These aren't real illnesses. This is a problem of behavior. This is a problem of character. These aren't people who deserve to get medical care in the same way someone with breast cancer deserves to get medical care. Which brings me to my third revolution, because this is where it gets really interesting. The idea that technology could maybe do more than just address the chemistry of the paint, could begin to address the fire in the near term. So let's look at that. Pretty amazing what's happened over the last 10 years, right? I mean, you've got this increase in smartphones. I think, what did I see? At 65% of Australians have a smartphone, and that's not even counting the children. Facebook users, look at this number, up from 12 million to 1.65 billion users per month. Google searches, and I'm not even sure those are official numbers. That's what I get off the web. Google doesn't actually publish the number of searches per day, but it's a lot. It's well over 3.5 billion. 10 years ago, there really wasn't an app store, so we don't know how many apps there were, but in 2006, when it started, the Apple had 15,000 apps. 2008, Apple had 15,000 apps in its app store, about 2 million as of last week. And really interesting is the change in the way we handle data, which is increasingly through machine learning. I love this blog that came out about a year ago in a journal, which I assume none of you would read, called TechCrunch. But this is Tom Goodwin, who said that Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook creates no content. Alibaba, the most valuable retailer, has absolutely no inventory. Airbnb owns no real estate. And as Tom said, something interesting is happening here. It's obvious that technology has changed so much of the world that we are in, for the better, sometimes maybe not for the better in other instances. But it's also obvious to most of us, particularly those of us in medicine, that somehow healthcare and medicine have been left out of this revolution. That what we do today is not that different from what we were doing a decade ago or 20 years ago. But that's changing. And I'll give you just a few examples. Just if you think about smartphones, which I said are now virtually ubiquitous, with 2 billion worldwide and increasing very, very quickly. This is a modern EKG machine. This is a modern otoscope to look at your middle ear. And this is a breathalyzer. Who knew that you could use your iPhone for that purpose? But even more to the point, think back to what I was saying just a few minutes ago about the barriers to bending the curve for mental illness. Think about that, because in some really obvious way, smartphone technology can address every one of them. I've tried to list this out here, but you can imagine how the access, fragmentation, delay, quality, all of these issues can be dealt with through apps that would be nearly ubiquitous. Even improving the workforce through training online or through telehealth. And maybe most of all, this issue with stigma, because suddenly people can be anonymous. People who would never go to see a therapist or go to see a psychiatrist can be able to get the care, at least some care that they need, and can learn much more about their illness in a way that allows them not to feel in any way singled out or shamed about it. The other piece of this, which I find particularly attractive, is that collecting data on phones, collecting data with wearables, collecting data about our behavior for the first time can give us what we've been missing. So this is a field that's entirely based on subjective reports of symptoms. Now, for the first time, we can collect measures of sleep, of activity, of location. We can actually look at someone's speech and voice and understand something about how people are changing. We can look at their social world. Are they emailing out more than they're emailing in, which happens a lot in mania? Are they spending less time on Facebook, which could be a good thing, but happens a lot in depression, becoming socially withdrawn? Are they turning off their phones, which happens a lot with depression as well? In fact, you can begin to build into a phone, and this is just one example. There are now several hundred examples of apps that have been developed for people with a variety of mental disorders. But you can build into this one simple instrument that is virtually ubiquitous, a whole range of different tools to help people learn about, manage their illness, get coaching as needed, and amazingly connect with others who have the same problem. It's a very, very powerful instrument to transform care. What I would say is there are probably 3 buckets where technology is really going to have a difference and could, in fact, begin to bend this curve. I'd like to think of this as a closed loop. One is what we call digital phenotyping. It's using the tools like smartphones to be able to collect data on individuals about how they're doing. Activity, sleep, voice, sociality, cognition, the things I just mentioned. And this is something that you do obviously with someone's consent. You do it because somebody is struggling with a problem and they need better data to understand when they're getting into trouble. We have interventions. Unlike the rest of medicine, in psychiatry and psychology, this is a place where a lot of the interventions are actually psychosocial. They're talking interventions. They're interventions that have to do with developing skills. You don't require surgery. You may not even require medication. And a lot of those, cognitive behavior therapy, coaching, peer support, can be done on a phone. And perhaps best of all, being able to get to someone at the moment when they need it. So when someone's in crisis, instead of saying, we'll have an appointment for you next Thursday at 10 o'clock, you're there with them in the moment when they need the help. And finally, being able to get past that fragmentation by coordinating care and the problems with the quality of care by providing standards of care. So there's a lot we can do here. Most of all, we can take all of these and pull them together into a closed loop to create this kind of learning engine so that all of a sudden your phenotyping tells you that you need more or less of the intervention, which in turn improves the way that you're managing the care and coordinating what you have to do. I think this is really an opportunity to be able to give us, for the first time, that beginning of putting out the fire, of something we can do in the short term that might begin to really make a difference. But I want to caution you that the word might is the operative one here. There's a lot we don't know. This is very, very early days in the use of technology, and we've seen lots of hype and sometimes more promise than delivery. From where I sit, there's sort of 2 issues that we're going to have to get serious about in the very short term if this is going to be useful, and if we're really going to be able to save lives by reducing suicide and improving the way in which people are able to recover. One is we have to actually demonstrate that this works. I think we have now a lot of evidence for feasibility, but we have very little evidence that this is truly effective, that it does save lives. We haven't yet been able often to engage people to use the technology we have. When people become depressed, one of the first things that happens is they stop using their phones. They don't charge them. So it's not that helpful to have a really cool app that can track behavior and give them cognitive behavior therapy if they're not willing to keep it charged. Big problem. Engagement inefficiency is a big issue, especially around care management. If this is causing more work and more hassle for people, they won't use it, whether that's a provider or a patient or a family member. That's about half the battle, or maybe in the case of mental health, more like 30% of the battle. Even more important is doing this in a way that ensures trust. And I'm sure as I've been talking about this, one of the things that you begin to think about is the kind of big brother quality of monitoring behavior online. Like, who wants that, right? And isn't that pretty creepy? And hey, by the way, isn't that what Google and Apple and all these companies do anyway? Aren't they actually taking our data and trying to profit from it? So really important that this is done in such a way that it's entirely transparent, that it gives patients and families and people who haven't even become patients yet full agency. And it also is handled in a very responsible way. What I'm actually saying is that the purpose of all of this is to give data, useful data, to people who need it. So we talk about that as empowerment, empowering patients and families with information. That's actually very much like the Google mission statement, which I didn't even know until I joined Alphabet 9 months ago. But the mission statement for Google originally was to collect and organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. We basically want to do that for health information, and particularly for mental health information, but we want that information to be owned by the person who has the greatest stake in getting it. So this is really critical to get this right. The empowerment is going to be essential to get the trust part. There's a book that came out recently which has a great title, which I think says it so much of what is happening in medicine and the way in which, as I just showed you with Airbnb and Uber and Alibaba and Facebook, it's going to happen in medicine as well. The book is titled "The Patient Will See You Now," and it gives you that sense that once information becomes democratized, once we make high-quality information available, it changes the relationships that we have with our healthcare providers. It makes us healthcare providers as well. At least it makes us who have the greatest stake have the tools we need to be able to get the kind of care that we deserve. So I've told you about these 3 revolutions. My guess is that the near-term wins are going to be with technology and information science. We didn't talk about machine learning, but that's a huge area that offers lots of excitement. I want to end by saying that I am very hopeful. I think this is an incredibly exciting time. It's part of why I left the public sector to join Alphabet and Verily, is because I thought there was an opportunity at this point to use technology not just for diabetes and cancer and heart disease, but for mental illness as well. But this is going to be a tough challenge. And I think just as a reality check, we have to realize that there are a lot of challenges to getting people engaged with technology who have depression, who have mania, who have schizophrenia. There's a denial of illness. There's a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. It's not easy to overcome a lot of what these disorders bring to the table. In fact, we often say that these illnesses are perhaps the only ones in medicine that may preclude their own treatment. That's really the insidious nature of these illnesses, is that they rob people of that sense of agency. They rob them of hope. They rob them of the ability often to get the treatments that they need. That's what makes this really difficult. It's also important to realize that the stigma issue, although I don't like that word, but we keep coming back to it, it's a real one. It's a real problem, that it's an issue for patients, for families, for providers, for the treatments that are given, and for the institutions that give them. It's, as I say here, it seems to be that everything here is stigmatized, except, oddly enough, the disorders themselves, which are the real culprits, and yet they often tend to be romanticized and are just about always misunderstood. But I'm hopeful. I think that these are challenges. I think we can enter into them responsibly. I think if we set our sights in a way that's reasonable, we'll make real progress. Bill Gates probably said it best when he said that we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We're at the very beginning of this period of what I think will be transforming this area of medicine. But what an exciting moment in time, and reason why I think all of us can look forward to the work that's, some of which is being done here at this university, at the Black Dog Institute at University of Sydney, because some of the absolute leaders in this field globally are right in your neighborhood here. Thank you very much.
so eager to get here, I fell over. What I wanted to do was to stop you going, just in case you were prepared to take some questions.
Love to take questions.
So could I open it up to the floor? We've got some roving microphones. And could I ask, just not because this is, we need names, but I think it's nice for a visitor to know who they are answering. So if you could just mention your name, and I will then just adjudicate a few questions, and then we'll ask the Vice-Chancellor to give the vote of thanks. There's a question over here from Professor Hubbard. Can we get a microphone to him? He's got a loud voice, but...
I'm Herbert Huppert. I'm a visitor to the University of New South Wales. And I think an important point, which, if I may say, I don't think you've quite brought out, is if you go to a doctor and you say, I have a broken leg, he can say exactly how long it'll take to repair, and he can do it right there. If you go and say, I'm mentally depressed, first of all, he doesn't know how long it'll take to get better. And secondly, it'll take a very long time, or compared to fixing up a broken leg. And I think that's an important point.
So I beg to disagree a little bit.
That makes it more interesting.
Especially on the broken leg part. So it's actually not a bad analogy, because what we usually think about with a broken leg is that there's an acute response and then a period of rehabilitation. And that's actually what we're talking about here. In the case of depression, for most people, whether it's medication or psychotherapy or sometimes ECT, which is probably the most powerful and predictable intervention, most people will get better, and they'll get better within 6 to 8 weeks. Now, up until recently, we didn't have interventions that would work within 6 to 8 hours. We do have that now with ketamine and with some experimental treatments. So we're at a point where I think we can offer something to people very quickly. But your analogy is right on the money, because I think what we haven't spent as much time thinking about is the rehab. That these are severely disabling disorders, and once you feel better, you're not better yet. There's a rehab period that may take months, and people have to be given the opportunity to recover in that sense, just as they would with the broken leg. And that actually is one of the places where psychosocial interventions can be so helpful.
Can I just come back for 1 second to say, it's ECT when it's applied to human beings. Psychologists do it an enormous amount, exactly the same thing to animals, and it's ECS then, electroconvulsive shock.
Yeah, it's one of these complicated areas where we have no idea how the intervention works, and yet if you take in well-controlled studies, that have been done all around the world for now 30 years, that 80% of people receiving this who have not responded to medications or psychotherapy are better within 4 weeks or less, usually within 2 weeks. It's a very dramatic intervention. How it works, we don't know. And actually, I think that's true in other areas of medicine as well. We sometimes have treatments that work really well, and we're not quite sure how that happens. We may think we know, but often we may not. So it reminds us that sometimes you can make progress even when you don't, you get lucky, and that may be the case here. It's not the way I wanted things to happen when I was at NIMH, but you can't control everything.
Peter Joseph Thom, Chair of the Black Dog Institute. Professor Helen Christensen, who runs Black Dog, is here tonight, and she and her team are running, as you're aware, some suicide prevention trials per courtesy of a $15 million donation from the Ramsay Foundation. They're the first such trials of this kind, we think, anywhere in the world. And if you really pin them down privately, they'll say that subject to the success of these trials, we could reduce the suicide rate in this country by a third or maybe even half in 4 years. It seems at the public policy level, we can't get the buy-in. I think it's the individual's problems rather than a community issue. What's happening in the US in this space and the community response?
Oh, thanks, Peter, for that question. I wish we had a Black Dog Institute in the US. We don't. And we don't have that kind of an effort going on currently. There's quite a bit of interest in suicide prevention. Much of it is focused on means reduction, which is tough to do. I must say it's been frustrating to get attention to this problem in the US and to get the public will to even put guardrails or nets under the Golden Gate Bridge, which is an iconic area for suicide, to get people to do anything about restrictions to firearms. 51% of the suicides in the United States involve firearms. So we're behind you. We really do need something like what Helen has done here, a large-scale effort using a range of different kinds of approaches to try to bring down this number. I just don't think the public has a clear understanding. And it's certainly, if you look at the media, it's just not there. You'll see it if there's a cluster of suicides. You'll see it if it's a celebrity suicide. But the fact that there are 8 or 9 suicides every day in Australia, and the fact we often say that with every suicide there are 11 victims, the person who died and 10 people who will never be the same. And you take those numbers, 2,864, and you multiply by 10, that's a big number. So we do not have yet, in most places, and I think Australia is way out in front here, but in most other places, and by that I mean the EU, especially the UK, where this has been an issue, and in the US, we don't have the public will and the drive to try to have an impact. My hope is that what Black Dog does and what Helen's projects will do will serve as a kind of leading edge. People will see that impact and they'll learn from it. And this could be really one of the ways in which Australia really contributes, as we've done in many other areas like the cochlear implant and others. This could be a place where what we learned here could really change the way we handle this issue all over the world.
Hi, Dr. Insel. So my name's Tina. I'm a student at this campus and I'm involved with a student organisation on this campus. So at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that 75% of adults experience an onset of mental illness before they're 25. And given that a large number of adolescents before 25 do attend uni, what are your thoughts on the role that the university should play in mental health prevention and treatment? Thanks.
Thanks, Tina. Before you sit down, can you give us a sense of what is done at the uni here? Because this is an issue. So what do you see? What's the response here, and what's available for people who need help within the university?
Okay, well, there's kind of 2 streams that happen at uni. There's a bit of funding for prevention, so through counselling and psychology services. We have a separate psychology clinic that students can get referrals to. But there's the demand for that is greater than what is supplied. And then through the student organisation, you have a lot of wellbeing initiatives that are more preventative rather than treatment. So there's kind of 2 streams going on campus, but I think a lot more could be done in terms of what the student survey feedback is on what they prefer on campus. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on what you think a uni should be providing.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that can be done. One of the things that is probably most important is for students to begin to demand what they need and to be really clear about that. And this is one of the places where technology is really helpful, is that students can begin to come together the way they have on so many other things, and they can create the groups that really begin to define the problem, the magnitude of the problem, the severity of the problem, and make it apparent to people who are responsible for your well-being as students here, that there's something more that needs to be done. It is utterly the case, as you started your question with, that if you were looking for the age group of people who are most likely to be struggling for the first time with a mental illness, it's particularly between about ages 15 and 22. So it's right in that, you're right in the hot zone. And the other great thing is that's also the time in which people are most likely to spend an awful lot of their time on their smartphone. So putting those two things together may be an opportunity, but it doesn't always happen. And what it usually takes is someone to start it. So hint, this may be an opportunity.
Our students ask the best questions. Can we have just two more and then we'll close it, please? I will just get you a microphone. It should be, there it comes.
Thank you. My name is Helen, and I'm a grandmother. I'm interested in the fact that ADHD has increased so dramatically in Australia and in the United States of America, and that it seems to often evolve after the ages of 15, 16, 17, 18, etc., into other possibilities like bipolar and so forth. So your talk has been wonderful for me, but I wonder whether this same kind of gathering of information about the very large numbers of children who are young now will benefit from this kind of broad grouping and technology, and what is your feeling about how that is going in the United States?
Well, it's the same problem, right? So what we've seen there is an enormous increase in ADHD and autism, eating disorders as well. But to be fair, we've also seen huge increases in type 1 diabetes, in food allergies, in a range of other pediatric problems. All of them have a funny flavor to them that's a little bit around the inflammatory system, the immune system. Lots of questions about whether some of this is driven by some broad environmental factor. We don't really know. And certainly that's an issue that's come up with both type 1 diabetes and autism. So I don't know that I can explain what's going on, but I think it is important to raise awareness about this issue. And as you say, to make sure that people understand the numbers that are involved. And they understand them not only because it's a problem, but these are problems that can be addressed. So to begin to increase the services and to move those services earlier and earlier in the trajectory so that you don't have a child who's had ADHD for 6 years untreated become a 16-year-old who's really, at that point, dealing with severe mood and anxiety problems.
For our last question, just over here.
Dr. Insel, Angus Campbell, I'm the Chief of the Australian Army, and your presentation today was fascinating and very, very insightful. I'm wondering if what you are seeing and learning can give also some insight into the possibilities of the kinds of lifestyles and interventions that can build resilience and mitigate the possibility of onset, particularly in emergency service professions and others like the military, where people can be exposed to circumstances that generate great mental stress.
Yeah, what a great question. And it's a really, in some ways, where a lot of the hopefulness is these days, is if we can move much earlier in this trajectory, are there interventions that we could build in the same way we do for physical fitness? Can we build mental fitness? And what would that look like? And when would we do it? And how do we do it in a way that's non-stigmatizing and that really does provide some resilience? Those are still very much research questions. I don't think we know how well that will work. The place where it's playing out most, and again, I don't mean to keep stressing this fact that Australia is ahead in everywhere, in every place, but in the world of headspace, where here you've got a nationwide effort to identify kids who may be at risk for psychosis much earlier, and then to provide them with a series of services that will hopefully reduce the risk of becoming psychotic? Can you avert the psychotic episode? Could you forestall it a year or two so this young person could finish high school or could start in uni? That's really the hope. One of the places where we're seeing a lot of activity on the research side is in creating video games, of all things, that actually build resilience. So we know that video games have impacts on skill-based learning. Could you do it in a way that builds executive function, that builds working memory, that builds judgment, all of those things? And that's still very much a work in progress, but it tells you that we're starting to rethink the way this is done. We've been in a world where for 4 decades, it seems like everything here was driven by medication, and that there was going to be a magic pill to fix these very complicated circuit problems of brain development. That just isn't the way it's going to play out. It's going to require being very thoughtful, probably combining medication, psychosocial treatments, maybe technology, bringing all of those together in a way that's highly individualized, very early in the course of problems, and then trying to, just as you say, build the resilience so that somebody becomes their best own advocate.
Tom, thank you. I was going to say that I would love to thank Tom for that thought-provoking, challenging, yet spiced with some optimism speech. But I know the Vice-Chancellor will do it better, and I know he'll kill me if I don't call upon him. And I now call upon the Vice-Chancellor, Ian Jacobs, to give the official vote of thanks.
Thank you, Chancellor. And thank you, Dr. Tom Insel, for a truly wonderful lecture. You started brilliantly by reminding us of the importance of coffee, food, and football. You got serious after that, and much more importantly, you opened up new windows for us on the subject of mental health that is of major concern to health workers, academics, politicians, educators, and community leaders around the world. It's no exaggeration to say, as you did, that we're experiencing an epidemic in mental health disorders, an enormous public health crisis, nothing less than that. As a cancer specialist, I'm used to quoting the appalling figures of incidence and survival in cancer, but I was shocked to hear some of the stats you showed. 26% of years lost to disability from mental health disorders, and 75% before 25 years of age, a chronic illness of young people. Truly shocking statistics. And everyone here will, following that, have valued your exciting insights into advances in the science of mental illness and the ways that research and technological progress can help those suffering from mental illnesses, which really are the big health challenge of the 21st century, as you so eloquently explained. You explained that mental illnesses are amongst the most common and disabling disorders, and that science has begun to change our view of those illnesses from behavioral problems to brain disorders which are due to functional changes in brain circuits. You described exciting and unexpected developments in genomics and brain imaging, and you showed us stunning images which have now begun to reveal the fundamental biology of psychosis as well as mood and anxiety disorders. And you noted that this really does bring into question existing diagnostic categories and treatment approaches. You described the really tantalizing prospect that new tools and information technologies involving novel sensors, software, computing, and analytic capabilities will enable us to achieve much more precise diagnostic classifications that ensure people will get the right treatment at the right time and allow prediction and preventative approaches to mental health. I know that everyone will have found these to be fascinating insights into a subject that until quite recently, was often kept behind closed doors. In any 1 year, we know that 1 in 5 adult Australians and 1 in 7 children aged 4 to 17 will experience some form of mental illness. We know that 1 in 3 Australians will have a mental illness in their lifetime, and we know that more than 2,500 Australians and 800,000 people worldwide will take their own lives every year, and that this is the most common cause of death in men under 45. And as you noted, these figures, shocking as they are not unique to Australia. They're reflected in most Western societies. For all of these reasons, mental health is something that we do take very seriously at UNSW for our 6,000 staff and our over 50,000 students in our direct assistance programs and in our teaching and research. We place great importance on our health services for students, including our UNSW counselling and psychological services, which offer students free, confidential counselling and self-help resources that promote well-being, help them adjust to university life, and promote access, overcoming, I hope to some extent, one of the barriers you identified, and to speed up intervention and diagnosis. But as Tina noted, there is a lot more that we can and want to do. We're also proud of a vast range of academic activities at UNSW related to mental health. Our Department of Psychiatry, our Centre for Healthy Brain Aging, the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, the Black Dog Institute, which, as you noted, is using smartphone technology to try and improve outcomes, our School of Psychology, and all of that linked by the Mind Gardens Neurosciences project, advancing what we see as a comprehensive, integrated effort focusing on depression, drugs and alcohol, behavioural change, and the developing brain, dementia, healthy ageing, and neurodegenerative disorders. I'm also delighted, and this is really important, that this work extends beyond health and science to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and the Faculty of Art and Design, which focus on key social issues of poverty, injustice, inequality, and mental illness, using approaches such as visualization and robotics to address and understand mental health issues. And just one example, Professor Jill Bennett is leading exciting new cross-disciplinary Arts for Health festivals, which I hope many of you will be involved in, which will focus on anxiety in 2017 and depression in 2018 with exhibitions, performances, symposia and public education programs. This range of activity reflects an understanding that how we might conquer mental health disorders is now a multidisciplinary task, linking art, design, medicine, science, technology, many health professionals, social scientists, engineers, software developers, and many, many others. These partnerships really do, as Dr. Insel explained, have the potential to deliver genuine breakthroughs. Tonight, Dr. Insel, you have advanced our understanding of that nexus between science, technology, mental health, and care. And within that, the possibilities of more individualized care, overcoming the stigma that you talked about, not only to save lives, but also to make troubled lives better again. Your talk has given us a glimpse of extraordinary developments in a field of vital interest to every one of us, and of the challenges we have to overcome to show that it works, to show that people will use it, that people will trust it, and that they'll be empowered by it. Thank you for a superb and exciting lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd ask you all now to join me in a show of appreciation for our Wallace Wurth Lecturer, Dr. Tom Insell.